Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Inventory channel. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest wherever they feel heavy. You don't need to do anything right now. You don't need to be anywhere. Just breathe, and let your eyes close when they're ready. Tonight, we're going somewhere cold, somewhere quiet. A city pressed under a gray sky, where the streets smell like snow and wood smoke, and where ordinary people carried an extraordinary secret pinned to their coats. This is a true story. Every detail you'll hear tonight really happened, and somehow knowing that makes it feel even more worth holding on to. In the early hours of April the 9th, 1940, the people of Norway were asleep. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that feels like any other bread in the kitchen, shoes by the door, the slow dark of early spring still pressing against the windows. Children were tucked into beds. Fishermen along the coast had already been awake for hours, as they always were, moving through the cold water in the dark. Teachers had their lessons prepared. Students had their books stacked on their desks. Life, as it had been, was still ordinary. Norway had spent the previous months trying to stay out of the war. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Norway declared itself neutral. It had done the same in the First World War, and it had worked then. The country was small, peaceful, and had no territorial quarrel with its neighbors. Most Norwegians were anti-German in sentiment. The public feeling was clear enough, but they were also a deeply pacifist nation. Organizations like Folkereisning mot Krig, the Norwegian section of War Resisters International, had strong roots in Norwegian society. Norway thought of itself as a peace nation. It still does. It is the country that awards the Nobel Peace Prize every year. But geography does not respect sentiment. Norway's position across the North Sea from Britain made it strategically essential to Germany. The British and French had mined the Norwegian coast to disrupt iron ore shipments from Sweden shipments that were vital to the German war machine. Germany needed Norway's ice-free harbors to protect those supply routes and to give its navy access to the North Atlantic. Whether Norway wished to be involved or not, it was already involved. Its coastline, its ports, its waters, all of it had become part of a calculation being made far away by people who had no interest in what Norwegians wanted. In the months before April, German ships had been passing through Norwegian waters with increasing frequency. The Norwegian government received intelligence that something was being prepared, but the details were unclear, and officials hesitated. A full invasion arriving without warning seemed, to many, implausible. In the early hours of that Tuesday, German warships moved into the Oslo fjord. The Norwegian coastal fortress at Oscarsborg opened fire, striking the German cruiser Blucher, which sank into the cold water of the fjord. It was an act of resistance that would be remembered because the delay it caused bought the royal family and the government just enough time to leave the capital. A few hours, that was all. But in those few hours, the course of Norway's occupation was shaped in ways that would matter for 5 years. By morning, German forces had landed simultaneously at nearly every major Norwegian city: Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Stavanger, Narvik. It was a coordinated operation designed to overwhelm before any organized response was possible. Within hours, the capital was under occupation. German soldiers stood on corners where, the day before, there had been only ordinary street life. The Norwegian people woke up to a country that was no longer entirely their own. By June of 1940, after 2 months of fighting with support from British and French forces, Norway surrendered. The military campaign was over. The occupation, the long, slow, grinding reality of it, was just beginning. Approximately 350,000 German troops would eventually be stationed in Norway. That is 1 soldier for every 8 Norwegian citizens. The weight of that presence, distributed across every city and town and road in the country, is difficult to fully imagine. King Haakon VII refused to surrender. In many occupied countries, governments collapsed quickly, fleeing or agreeing to terms. Haakon, who had been king since 1905, rejected the German demand that he legitimize the occupation by accepting their appointed leadership. He refused without drama and without negotiation. The Germans had hoped to capture him and the Norwegian parliament to give the occupation a surface of legitimacy, to make it look, from the outside, as though Norway had agreed to what was being done to it. Haakon's refusal made that impossible. He and the government moved north through Norway's remote interior, staying ahead of the German advance, broadcasting to the Norwegian people by radio. In June of 1940, Haakon left for Britain aboard the British heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire. From London, he continued to broadcast to his country throughout the war. His voice, traveling through static across the distance, told his people that the legitimate government of Norway had not accepted what had happened, that it was still there, that Norway still existed, even under occupation. His refusal to collaborate meant that Norway never produced a legitimate collaborating government of the kind Germany had hoped for. What emerged instead was a figure named Vidkun Quisling. Quisling was Norwegian, which was part of what made him so deeply resented. He was a former military officer who had founded a Norwegian fascist party, the National Samling, in 1933, modeled on the German movement. He had met Hitler personally and secured the Führer's official support. But his following in Norway was small, and his credibility among ordinary Norwegians was essentially non-existent. On the day of the invasion, without German authorization, he went on Norwegian radio and declared himself head of government. The Germans were initially irritated by this. His uncoordinated announcement created confusion at a moment when they needed order. In the days that followed, members of Norway's Supreme Court took the initiative to establish an administrative council, an attempt to create some form of legitimate governance that might stop Quisling's self-declared takeover. The legitimate Norwegian government refused to give the council any legal backing. The Germans ended up disbanding it. Eventually, they settled on Quisling as a useful instrument, installing him as minister-president in February of 1942, giving the occupation a Norwegian face, however unconvincing that face proved to be. Among his first acts were abolishing the country's constitution and declaring himself dictator. Within a few years of the war's end, his name had entered the English language as a common noun, a quisling, a person who collaborates with an enemy occupier. It is an unusual kind of legacy to become a synonym for betrayal. Occupation does not arrive as a single dramatic event. It settles in gradually through accumulating restrictions, through the slow erosion of what was ordinary. The Germans administered Oslo with a deliberate emphasis on normality. They wanted compliance, and they wanted daily life to continue in a way that made the occupation feel permanent and unremarkable. There were curfews, regulations on what could be published, controls on what could be taught in schools. Soldiers were stationed throughout the city, but the trams still ran, the offices still opened. The shops were still there, even if what was available in them was dwindling. Food became one of the most immediate and daily expressions of occupation. Rationing was introduced, and it tightened over time. Norwegians had to adapt, relying on substitute ingredients, managing with less, reorganizing their daily lives around the scarcity of basic necessities. What had once been ordinary bread, butter, meat, coffee became scarce or unavailable. People grew vegetables in whatever space they had. They adapted recipes. They shared. The kitchen, which had always been the center of Norwegian domestic life, became a place of constant improvisation and quiet problem-solving. People walked to work and passed German soldiers on the corners. They stood in rationed queues at shops while officers moved past. Life continued, but under conditions that required constant watchfulness. In a city where a careless word could be reported, trust became something extended carefully, in small amounts, and only to those known deeply. The burden of sustained vigilance, of never quite being able to relax, of monitoring every word before it left your mouth, is its own particular form of exhaustion. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. Norwegian culture, historically, tended toward restraint, toward expressing conviction through steadiness rather than confrontation. The Norwegian word for this quality is difficult to translate exactly, but it involves a kind of dignity that does not need to be performed. When resistance emerged, it reflected that character. It was quiet, careful, and expressed through accumulated small decisions rather than open challenge. There were those who collaborated. Some held genuine political sympathies with fascism and had supported Quisling's party before the invasion. Others acted out of fear or saw opportunity in the new arrangement. They were a minority. Most Norwegians wanted no part of the occupation and its institutions. The press was brought under control quickly. Newspapers that refused to comply were shut down. Editors who resisted were arrested. Within months, what Norwegians could read in their own publications was a managed version of events German military progress reported as decisive, Norwegian resistance minimized or ignored. The official story and the true story diverged, and Norwegians had to navigate the gap between them every day. Underground newspapers appeared almost immediately in response, printed on available paper, passed hand to hand through offices and homes, left in coat pockets or slipped under doors. They were dangerous to produce and dangerous to possess. People produced and possessed them anyway. Access to accurate information in those conditions was itself a form of resistance. The church became another institution of quiet defiance. Norwegian bishops and clergy began speaking out against occupation measures affecting their congregations. In 1942, nearly all of Norway's bishops resigned their state positions in protest, a significant institutional act in a country where the church held deep community importance. The Bishop of Oslo had already protested the previous year against a proposed law that would have prohibited marriage between people of Norwegian background and Jewish people. The law was never passed, in part because of that pressure. Small resistances accumulating, and then there were the Jews of Norway. At the time of the invasion, there were approximately 2,100 Jews living in Norway, including around 350 refugees from Germany and Austria who had fled to Norway in the 1930s, looking for safety. Initially, the measures against them were sporadic, but they escalated steadily over the years of the occupation. In October of 1940, radios belonging to Jewish families were confiscated by the German security police. In January of 1942, all Jews in Norway were required to present themselves at local police stations to have their identification papers stamped with a large letter J. They also had to complete detailed registration forms. Their businesses were placed under the control of commissioners. Their property was confiscated. In October of 1942, all male Jews in Trondheim were arrested. On the 26th and 27th of October, 260 male Jews were arrested in Oslo. On the night of the 25th and 26th of November, all remaining Jews in Oslo, women, children, the sick, the elderly, people with disabilities were arrested. The arrests were carried out not by German soldiers, but by Norwegian police. They were taken to the pier at Akershuskeia in Oslo, where a cargo ship, the SS Donau, was waiting. 532 people boarded that ship. They were taken to Germany, and from there to Auschwitz. Of the approximately 770 Jews deported from Norway during the war, only 34 survived. Not one woman or child survived the first round of selections at Auschwitz. Around 1,000 Norwegian Jews managed to escape to neutral Sweden with the help of underground networks, warned by Norwegian police officers and resistance members who risked their own lives to do so. But hundreds did not escape in time. The occupation that had begun with soldiers on street corners and rationed bread had, by 1942, become something far darker. It was into this atmosphere, this accumulating weight of restriction, surveillance, loss, and fear that the paperclip entered, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a quiet one, the quietest possible. A bent piece of wire, worn on a coat. To understand why the paperclip mattered, you have to understand what had already been taken away. From the first weeks of occupation, the Germans had banned symbols of Norwegian royalty. No buttons, no images, no likenesses of King Haakon could be worn on a person. This was deliberate. The king was the most visible symbol of a Norway that had refused to accept the occupation. His face, his name, his image were all a reminder that the legitimate government had not surrendered, that the occupation was not legal, that what had happened to Norway was not what Norway had chosen. Banning his image was an attempt to erase that reminder from daily public life, to make the occupation feel more inevitable, more permanent, more like the natural order of things. Norwegians needed another symbol, something that could not be banned, something that said the same thing. I am Norwegian. I am not alone. I have not accepted this without saying anything that could be pointed to. The paperclip, in Norwegian, is called a binder. The word means simply something that binds, that holds things together. When Norwegian students began wearing paperclips on their lapels in the autumn of 1940, and historians identify this as the first mass outbreak of civil disobedience. During the occupation, they were choosing an object whose meaning was layered and exact. First, there was the national connection. At the time, most Norwegians believed that the paperclip had been invented by a fellow Norwegian named Johan Vaaler. Vaaler was a real person born in 1866, trained in electronics and mathematics, employed at a Norwegian invention office. He did patent a paper fastening device in Germany in 1900 and in the United States in 1901. The problem, which was not widely known at the time, is that his design was different from the gem clip, the double-looped shape we still use today. The gem clip had been manufactured in Britain since around the 1870s and was already widely available across Europe before Vaaler filed his patents. Vaaler's version required the outer wire to be lifted and the papers pushed in at an angle because his design lacked the second loop that allows papers to be inserted flatly. It was, in other words, an inferior design that was already outdated by the time he patented it. But none of that was known to the people wearing paperclips on the streets of Oslo in 1940. To them, the paperclip was a Norwegian invention. Wearing one was wearing a piece of their own national history on their coat. It was, at once, a statement of unity. We are bound together, and a statement of identity. We are Norwegian, and we are still here. Second, there was the solidarity dimension. When the Germans required Jewish residents of Oslo to wear a yellow star to mark them as separate from the rest of the population, some Norwegians responded by wearing paperclips as a counter-symbol, a visible statement that they did not accept the logic of separation, that they stood with their Jewish neighbors. The paperclip, which bound things together, was worn as a rejection of what the yellow star was meant to enforce. Third, and perhaps most powerfully, there was the deniability. A paperclip carries no flag, no slogan, no image of a king. If a German soldier stopped you on the street and demanded to know why you were wearing one, there was nothing to say except that it was a paperclip, an office supply. What possible law had been broken? And yet among Norwegians, the meaning was understood immediately. Passing someone on the street who wore one carried a specific and unmistakable recognition. The meaning did not need to be spoken. It traveled in a glance. The practice spread beyond the university. Professors wore them. Shopkeepers wore them. Teachers wore them on their lapels while standing in front of their classrooms. Students wore them as bracelets and necklaces, fashioning small pieces of jewelry from the simple wire loops, symbolically binding themselves together in the face of everything that was trying to divide and diminish them. Ordinary men and women on their way to work in the morning wore them under their coats, the clip just visible at the collar. It became a form of communication that the occupiers could read, but could not easily address. Eventually, they decided to address it anyway. The Germans understood what the paperclip represented. They banned it. Wearing one became illegal. People caught with a paperclip visible on their coat could be arrested, questioned, and punished. An object found in any office drawer, in any classroom, in any home, had become contraband. The occupation authorities had been forced by a piece of bent wire to reveal exactly how seriously they took the quiet, daily refusal of the people they were occupying. The ban required soldiers to examine people's lapels on the street. It required enforcement mechanisms for something that, on its surface, was nothing at all. And it demonstrated, more clearly than any speech could have, that the occupiers understood very well what was being communicated. People continued wearing them. Not everyone, not without fear, but enough that the ban accomplished little except to make the resistance more visible, not less. A resistance leader and schoolteacher named Haakon later reflected on this period. He said that what was done often seemed ridiculous, that the small gestures, the turned backs, the paper clips seemed, in the moment, insufficient to the scale of what was happening. But he also said that these things had the effect of uniting all the opposition forces, that the ridiculousness was, in its way, the point. An occupying power that bans paper clips is an occupying power that is losing the argument, and everyone in Oslo could see it. Then came the teachers. In the winter of 1942, the occupation authorities moved to bring Norwegian schools under direct ideological control. Quisling's government demanded that teachers join a newly established compulsory professional body, the Norwegian Teachers Association. But this was not a professional organization in any meaningful sense. It was an instrument of the regime, designed to incorporate teachers into the occupation's educational agenda, requiring them to instruct Norwegian children according to a curriculum shaped by Nazi ideology. To join was to agree, formally and explicitly, to become an agent of the occupation inside the classroom, More than 12,000 Norwegian teachers refused to join. Out of approximately 14,000 teachers in the country at the time, the refusal was nearly total. The letters declining membership were coordinated, drafted through underground networks, circulated widely, and signed individually by each teacher who sent one. The letters were almost identical in their language because they had been prepared together and distributed deliberately. Each person who signed knew what they were risking. Each one signed anyway. The occupation's response came quickly. Over 1,000 teachers were arrested and held under difficult conditions, subjected to sustained pressure to reverse their refusals. They were told they would be released if they agreed to cooperate. Most did not reverse their position. Then, in freight cars, the same type of cattle wagons being used across occupied Europe to transport people to camps, more than 500 Norwegian teachers were deported north to Kirkenes, a remote settlement near the Norwegian-Soviet border above the Arctic Circle. The journey was harsh. The conditions at Kirkenes were harsh. They were put to forced labor. The intention was to break them, to make an example at scale of what happened when you said no to the occupation, and to show every other Norwegian professional what they could expect if they followed the teachers' example. The teachers did not break. And while they were in Kirkenes, something happened at home that the occupation authorities had not anticipated. The schools closed because there were no teachers to run them. Children came home in the middle of the day. Parents demanded to know why. And the story of what had happened to the teachers, which had received no coverage whatsoever in the occupation-controlled press, spread through Norwegian society through the most reliable network available, ordinary people talking to each other. The school closures were, unintentionally, the most effective publicity the teachers' resistance could have received. The entire country became aware of what 12,000 teachers had done. There was an enormous and sustained outcry, letters, organized protests, pressure from church leaders, from families, from every corner of Norwegian civil society that still had a voice. The occupation authorities, who needed a minimum level of Norwegian cooperation to administer a country they were occupying with one soldier for every 8 citizens, found themselves managing a unified public resistance they had badly miscalculated. By the autumn of 1942, most of the deported teachers had been returned home. They had not joined the association. They had not agreed to teach the occupation's curriculum. The deportation had achieved nothing except to demonstrate the regime's willingness to use extreme force against civilians and to deepen irreversibly the contempt of the Norwegian population for everything the occupation represented. The teachers came home, and Norwegian children continued to learn, in school, what their teachers chose to teach them, not what Quisling's government had demanded. The paperclip, through all of this, remained, worn by the same teachers who had signed those letters, worn by the students who had watched their teachers be taken away and return. A symbol not of dramatic resistance, but of the kind that is sustained quietly through ordinary objects and daily decisions over years. a small silver loop that said, "Without saying anything, we are still bound together. You have not separated us." There is a particular quality to hope in prolonged adverse conditions. It is distinct from optimism. Optimism rests on a favorable assessment of probability, on the idea that things will probably work out. Hope operates in the presence of genuine reason for despair. It is a sustained orientation toward a future that cannot yet be confirmed, maintained in the face of evidence that might justify abandoning it. The Norwegian people maintained that orientation through 5 years of occupation, and they did so through a combination of organized resistance and accumulated small refusals. The military resistance Milorg, the clandestine organization that worked in coordination with the British Special Operations Executive, gathered intelligence, conducted sabotage operations against German infrastructure, and helped Allied personnel escape across the border into Sweden. The intelligence organization XU, established by a student named Arvid Storsveen and staffed largely by students from the University of Oslo, was described by historians as one of the most efficient intelligence-gathering operations in occupied Europe. Notably, 2 of its 4 leaders were women, among them Anne Sophie Østvedt. During the entire occupation, 1,433 members of the Norwegian resistance were killed. 255 of them were women. In 1943, Norwegian resistance fighters conducted one of the most consequential acts of sabotage of the entire war. A heavy water manufacturing plant at Vemork was destroyed. Heavy water containing a heavy isotope of hydrogen, was essential to Germany's nuclear research program. Without it, Germany's path toward a nuclear weapon became significantly more difficult. A second operation the following year sank a ship carrying 590 kilograms of heavy water on a Norwegian lake. Together, these operations are credited with substantially delaying Germany's nuclear program. They were conducted by small teams of Norwegians, operating in extreme cold under conditions of constant danger. But the resistance also operated at a level that rarely appears in military histories. Norwegians on the city trams turned their backs on German soldiers so consistently that the occupation eventually issued regulations against it. It became illegal to stand on a bus if seats were available, because Norwegians were refusing to sit beside German soldiers. The behavior continued regardless. Across Oslo and other cities, what became known as the Ice Front, a deliberate, collective, social coldness toward the occupiers, was normalized, not open hostility, which could be punished, just absence, the systematic refusal to acknowledge or engage. Many Norwegians pretended to speak no German, though it was, at the time, nearly as commonly understood as English is today. When members of Quisling's National Samling appeared in public spaces, they were met with silence and turned backs. When known collaborators entered shops, service was slow and unwelcoming. The social fabric of the country organized itself, quietly and consistently, around the exclusion of those who had chosen the wrong side and the inclusion of those who had not. The BBC broadcast Norwegian language programming throughout the occupation news, information, and verification of events the occupation-controlled press would not report. The Germans confiscated civilian radio sets, knowing how important they were. Norwegians hid them. They listened in back rooms and under blankets with the volume low, pressing their ears to the speaker. Knowing what was actually happening in the war, that Germany was not winning as decisively as the occupation presented, made the occupation feel temporary rather than permanent. It kept the future real. Children who grew up during these years learned to navigate two distinct bodies of knowledge: what was said at school and what was said at home. The gap between official narrative and private truth was something they understood early and completely. Norwegian high school students refused to join the Nazi youth movement. To punish their defiance, Nazis broke into schools and beat teachers and teenagers. Despite threats, arrests, and bribes, the occupation failed to attract young people into its movement and eventually gave up trying to enforce membership. The food supply remained restricted. The winters were long. The regulations multiplied. And underneath all of it, something persisted that the occupation could not legislate away the population's sense of continuity with a Norway that had existed before the occupation and would exist after it. The King's voice on the radio from London, steady and regular, reinforced that continuity. His authority, in the ways that mattered to the people listening, had never been interrupted. As the war progressed, the military situation in Europe shifted. The German campaign in the Soviet Union faltered. The United States entered the conflict. Allied operations succeeded in North Africa, then in Italy, then at Normandy in June of 1944. The occupation's claim to permanence became increasingly difficult to sustain. Norwegians, following events through their hidden radios and underground papers, watched the distance between the present moment and the end of the occupation begin to close. Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945. In Oslo, people came into the streets. The city that had maintained 5 years of careful, deliberate quiet became loud with voices, with movement, with a sound that had been absent for a long time. King Haakon returned to Norway on June the 7th, 1945, exactly 5 years to the day after he had left aboard HMS Devonshire. The crowds were large enough that photographs from that day show streets in which the pavement is not visible. The king came home to a country that had held itself together in his absence and held itself together for him. Quisling was arrested. He was tried and found guilty of treason. He was executed on the 24th of October, 1945. The deported teachers returned. The universities resumed without occupation oversight. The newspapers printed without censorship. The radios were brought out from where they had been hidden. The yellow stars were gone. The identification papers stamped with the letter J were gone. Though of the approximately 770 Jews deported from Norway, only 34 came home. And the paperclip. In Norway today, the paperclip remains associated with the occupation period and with the form of resistance it came to represent. A 7-meter-tall paperclip sculpture stands outside the BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo, placed there in connection with Johan Wahler, who studied at a predecessor institution on that site. It depicts the gem clip, not Wahler's own design, an irony that the historians have noted. The monument honors not just a man and his patent, but what his country's people did with the idea of his invention during 5 of the hardest years in their history. The Norwegian resistance is more often remembered for its armed operations for Milorg, for the sabotage at Vemork, for the intelligence networks that served the Allied cause across 5 years of occupation. Those operations were significant. The people who conducted them accepted serious personal risk, and a significant number of them died. But the paperclip represents something alongside all of that. It represents resistance conducted by people who had no access to weapons or intelligence networks, by students on their way to class, by teachers standing in front of their classrooms, by shopkeepers and office workers and ordinary residents of an occupied city who chose, through small and repeated acts, not to accommodate themselves to what had been imposed on them. They refused to normalize it. They refused to perform acceptance they did not feel. They refused to let the occupation have their quiet compliance, which was, in the end, the one thing it most needed from them to function. The occupation could regulate behavior in public spaces, control what was published, dictate what was taught in schools. It could confiscate radios and ban flags and stamp identification papers with letters. But it could not control what a person chose to carry, quietly, on their coat, a small piece of bent wire that held, for those who wore it, the weight of something much larger than itself, the weight of a country that refused to forget what it was. The war ended. The occupation ended. Norway endured. Let that settle for a moment. A small silver loop, the weight of it almost nothing, a single strand of wire, bent twice. What it carried, in the coat pockets and on the lapels of ordinary people on ordinary streets, in a country that refused to forget what it was. Now, there is nothing left to hold on to. Let the story rest where it is. Let your breathing slow down. Let the images soften at the edges. The streets of Oslo, under grey winter light, the cold water of the fjord at Oscarsborg, a classroom. The teacher's chair is empty. The low static of a radio, pressed close in a back room somewhere in the city. The voice of a king, traveling across the distance, reaching the people who were waiting for him. These people lived through years of difficulty and uncertainty and fear, and they came through it. The world they held on to, the one they refused to give up, the one they passed quietly from hand to hand in coat pockets and underground newspapers and paperclip bracelets, is still here. So are you. Rest now. The story is safe. The night is quiet. Good night. This has been the Sleepy Inventory.